Sniper on the Eastern Front. The Memoirs of Sepp Allerberger. Chapter 2, A Sniper Emerges. Part 2.
My company, 7./144, was ordered to cover the regiment's withdrawal. 60 Jaeger occupied a village at a strategically important crossroads in order to hold back the Russian motorized advance. Enemy reconnaissance quickly established the pitifully small strength of the unit. The Soviets encircled us and stood poised to wipe us out. 7./144 was a veteran and well-disciplined fighting force. Well dug in and with accurate defensive fire, we kept the Russians at a distance. Even tank and anti-tank rounds presented us with few problems in our foxholes. It was in battles such as this one that the sniper's hour arrived. At ranges up to 300 meters, shot after shot found its billet. At the focal point of all our battles, I made my appearance and forced the enemy on the defensive by my almost infallible shooting. My nerves were of steel. I knew this for sure as each projectile found its way with deadly certainty into the Russian ranks. In these desperate encounters, it gave us a decisive edge if one could undermine the enemy's fighting spirit. The experienced sniper, therefore, aimed less for fatal hits than for hits to the torso, which put a man out of action and left him screaming in agony. The scheme of a Russian attack was to send forward their troops in waves. The first two waves would usually be armed, the rear two waves often weaponless. As the first two waves were cut down, the rear attackers advanced over the corpses of their comrades, availing themselves of the weapons no longer needed by the dead. This was an interesting strategy that must have had an unenviable effect on their troops' morale. After some thought, I developed my own response to perfection. I would bide my time until the four waves were on their way towards our lines, then open rapid fire into the two rear waves, aiming for the stomach. The unexpected casualties at the rear and the terrible cries of the most seriously wounded tended to collapse the rear lines and so disconcert the two leading ranks that the whole attack would begin to falter. At this point, I could now concentrate on the two leading waves, dispatching those Soviets closer than 50 meters with a shot to the heart or the head. Enemy soldiers who had turned and run I transformed into men screaming with pain with a shot to the kidneys. At this, an attack would frequently disintegrate altogether. In such an engagement, I would often fire off more than 20 rounds, none of which counted towards my final total of kills. In this manner, over 2 days, in cooperation with comrades, I played my part in saving 7./144. On the second night, the company escaped the encirclement, taking with it 13 wounded. I held the rear, keeping the pursuers at a respectful distance with accurate sniper fire until, at first light, we re-established contact with our main front line. The question of ethics and honor involved in my tactics is open to question. But against such an enemy as the Soviets, who had no hesitation in slaughtering the prisoners they took and outnumbered us 10-1, I considered it justified in the circumstances. Reaching the precarious safety of our battle line did not mean that we could have a good rest. At daylight, the Russians attacked anew, although they seemed cautious. They had a new ruse, sending forward 3 T-34s supported by infantry, and from cover we listened to the monsters trundling in our direction. I had dug a hollow along our defensive line of improvised positions, which the infantry had done their best to camouflage. At about 150 meters from our trenches, the leading T-34 jolted to a sudden stop. The turret rotated with an audible hum and the gun swept the terrain as if sniffing for us. When the turret stopped, the hatch opened a few seconds later. I aimed the crosswires of my telescopic sight at the lid. A head protruded 2 hands' breadth above the rim, and a pair of hands raised binoculars to the head's eyes. I had calibrated my weapon on a pinpoint at 120 meters. If he raised himself much higher, I would be bound to score. In this situation, it was absolutely essential that the shot was good, for it would signal the firefight to begin. I hesitated briefly, during which time it occurred to me that this individual was probably not only the commander of the tank, but possibly of the entire attack. His death might decide the affair in our favor. I took a deep breath, concentrated, put myself into a calm frame of mind, drew back the trigger evenly, and the shot cracked out. Through the sight, I saw a torrent of blood spatter the hatch lid, after which the head disappeared. Seconds later, everybody began firing. The 3 tanks, immobile, rained a harmless fire above our lines. After a few minutes, their motors started up and the colossi reversed, confirming my assumption. The Soviet attack was now leaderless, and when the Soviet follow-up began an hour later, it lacked impetus and conviction. A single bullet had rendered the enemy assault literally headless, and in all probability enabled us to ward it off. The offensive petered out on the 20th of September, by which time the German front had been shortened, consolidated, and the enemy breakthrough prevented thanks to the fighting spirit of 3. GD, in the bitter fighting, 7 144ths lost more than half its complement. The survivors were exhausted and lice-infested, the majority either wounded or sick. The superhuman struggle they had waged for insignificant, nameless areas on a map was etched into their faces. Personally, I had come through unscathed, except for the lice, and diarrhea occasioned by a recent staple diet of salted gherkins found in an outhouse on a Russian farm. During the lull, the division erected the Wotan Line. This temporary front induced in us a nostalgia for home, being a territory once inhabited by Volga Germans, long since deported by the Soviets. The small, neat towns and villages had names like Heidelberg, Tiefenbrunn, and Rosenberg. The houses had been abandoned but left in such good order, with cooking utensils hanging neatly in cupboards, that it looked for all the world like the former occupants would return at any moment. We dug in, mindful that within a few days or weeks the hurricane of destruction would sweep over it all. It was here that we experienced the first ugly premonitions of what was to befall our own nation, an omen of what lay ahead. While the Red Army regrouped for a new offensive, GJR 144 was near Gendelberg, its inadequate numbers swelling with convalescents and those returning from leave. The supply of weapons and ammunition to us was well below expectations. All the more essential had it therefore become to conduct a thorough reconnaissance of the terrain and identify the places where an enemy attack was likely to be focused, and accordingly where our own limited forces should best be located. It was of equal importance to deceive the enemy as to our meager numbers by daring raids. Each early morning and at dusk I was to be found scouting ahead of our lines. It was my purpose to keep unwary Russian forward patrols away from our lines by surprise-accurate fire, to decimate their numbers and drive the survivors back to their own trenches in disarray. The usual patrol they sent out had the single objective of spotting our positions, and in general they did not expect to run up against a lone sniper well out into no man's land. When they did, it tended to stun them momentarily, allowing me to rapidly shoot dead a number of the party before they either gathered their wits sufficiently to find cover or withdrew to a safe distance. So it was that at dawn, one beautiful autumn morning in late September, I lay well disguised on the wooded summit of a small hill, observing a Russian artillery emplacement no more than a kilometer distant, when from a copse about 150 meters away there came into a clearing directly along my line of sight. A Russian patrol led by a boyish lieutenant. The platoon appeared not to have a care in the world and waddled along like a gaggle of geese in the sunshine. With due presence of mind, careful not to betray my lair, I moved my rifle into position and through the scope watched the undisciplined troop below me. I determined that the officer probably came from highly placed Russian political circles, for contrary to normal practice, he wore a tailor-made uniform of the finest cloth and wonderful boots of best leather. Spellbound by the scene, finger on the trigger, I saw the lieutenant suddenly stumble as he caught his foot against the exposed root of a tree. After regaining his balance and composure, he withdrew from a pocket a white handkerchief with embroidered edging and proceeded to wipe his fingers and flick at the dust on his boots. For weeks, I had been in the closest association with filth, vile stenches and fleas, locked in a daily, ruthless struggle for survival, and I saw the humor of the situation. Alas, there was no place for sentimentality in this war. To spare this platoon of kids might still have led indirectly to immediate danger for myself and my regiment. While the lieutenant carefully shook the handkerchief and folded it meticulously before replacing it in his breast pocket, I aimed the crosswires of the telescopic sight at his heart. With a morbid inner smile, I reflected on the ritual now unfolding, the poetic art of killing known to the Japanese samurai in their bushido, and with a strange lightness of heart squeezed the trigger for the lieutenant's finale. While the sound was still cracking the morning stillness, the young officer looked with horror at the hole in his chest, from which a small fountain of blood was pulsing. While his platoon ran shouting in panic in all directions, he sank slowly to his knees. His eyes looked for the last time to the sky, and then he toppled sideways into the undergrowth. After I shot dead 2 of his men, imprudently attempting to drag him back into the clearing, the others elected to remain in concealment and eventually withdrew without ever knowing from whence the fatal shots came. I knew, of course, that my lair had outlived its purpose and, like the phantom of the woods, quickly made myself scarce. My scouting activity had given me a good idea of how the enemy was massing his forces. My reports, and those made by other snipers, were an important part of the mosaic of German short-range reconnaissance, predicting the focal points of the impending offensive. At 8 on the morning of the 26th of September, 1943, hundreds of lightning flashes lit the eastern horizon with a diabolical light. A growling howl neared the German positions and swelled to a deafening roar as the abyss of hell opened. The cargo of hundreds of guns and Stalin organs merged into a single developing explosion. The air sighed with splinters and flying chunks of earth. Gas and dust made it difficult to breathe. As the first wave of explosions died away, a maximum of self-control was required as we heard the shattering screams of the wounded and mutilated. We cowered into our trenches and foxholes as deeply as we could. Some offered prayers or silent petitions for mercy. Others grabbed at hysterical comrades bent on making a run for it in the open. Under the impact of high explosives, the earth trembled. The air developed into a suffocating mix of dirt, gases, and metal splinters. Helpless as a child, I assumed the fetal position in my foxhole. A gigantic explosion nearby deafened and confused me momentarily. I looked up to see a great shower of earth and a dark object flying towards me over the trench parapet. Instinctively, as I ducked my head, the object thudded down in the filth. I recoiled in horror. The steaming remains of a comrade from the adjacent trench. A torso without limbs, its chest, neck, and face ripped by metal splinters into a bloody, amorphous mass, had come to join me. The mouth of the thing, surprisingly unhurt, began to groan, and a guttural voice spoke as if from another world.
"What happened? Why is it so dark? Why can't I feel my body anymore?"
Unable to understand, the stumps of the upper arms shrugged helplessly.
"Help me!"
The remains implored with a gurgle. Panic seized me. Almost in hysteria, I kept to the trench wall so as not to have to touch the mutilated torso. The moribund object began to cry, but in answer to my prayers, he soon died. Deaf to the hellish backdrop of tank guns and mortars, I attempted to compose myself, for the infantry attack was imminent. As abruptly as it had begun a half hour before, the barrage stopped, to be replaced by the rattle of tank tracks and the hurrah of the approaching Russian infantry. In a split second, we emerged from our shock. While medics attended the seriously wounded, those of us still in a condition to fight raised our rifles to the trench parapets and returned the Russian fire. With deadly accuracy, round after round from my carbine found a billet in the ranks of the attackers. The barrel grew so hot that the anti-rust grease melted and dripped over my fingers. Shells continued to pound our lines and the air was thick with metal splinters. I was mobile, moving from trench to trench, always seeking cover, snatching ammunition from dead Russians who had almost made it. Along a small sector of the front, there seemed little sense to it all. Our objective was mere survival. The individual soldier knew nothing of the greater scheme in which this Russian offensive was linked to their attempt to break through our lines at the lower Dnieper. For 8 long days, the battle raged, constantly switching between attack, defense, and counterattack. German companies and regiments melted away, lacking reserves. The dressing stations worked day and night. An unending chain of buckets full of human tissue and amputated limbs made the trip to waste trenches behind the operating tents. Hundreds of men waited for their turn under the knife, groaning, crying, dying. The medics were quite ruthless in segregating out the hopeless cases. Some met death in a state of morphine intoxication, but the majority died alone and in agony. Many of the most hopeless cases were put out of their misery where they lay if the danger existed that they might fall into Soviet hands, for the enemy practiced diabolical tortures of the wounded as a matter of routine. It was in this environment, as a youth of 19 years, that I lost what remained of my innocence. I determined to sell my life as dearly as possible, and in doing so developed an extraordinary professionalism. I kept my nerve where others succumbed to panic. I used my sniper's rifle as a surgical weapon with deadly precision. I had the feel for battle, knew the rhythm of defense, cover, attack. My lack of fear for injury and death amounted to a state of mind that one calls bravery. It is one of the strange things about war that a few soldiers appear invulnerable to serious injury or death. I was one of these, and there can be no doubt that Hitler also had this same gift of avoiding serious injury at the front, living a charmed life in the trenches of the Western Front from 1914 to 1918. On the 4th of October 1943, the fighting abated, allowing our exhausted and much reduced force a few days to regroup. 5 days later, the Red Army resumed its attack on what remained of 3. GD, which had outnumbered by 20 to 1. The obligatory artillery barrage began at 10 in the morning. 400 batteries and 220 Stalin organs pounded our lines with 15,000 exploding projectiles per hour. The division went to ground, and when it stopped, men came forth like zombies out of the steaming sulfuric air and churned earth surrounding their positions. In despair, they readied themselves, each Jaeger a true soldier hewn from the granite rock of self-control, battle experience, dourness, and determination to come through. Like a flood wave, the Russian soldiers of foot came towards them. Their reserve of expendable men seemed inexhaustible, while the Wehrmacht units, composed of all there was and no reserves, shrank ever smaller. The Red Army grew ever larger. In this, it was helped, in no small measure, by the Japanese decision not to pressurize the Siberian frontier, and so allow its defenders to be transferred to the Russian Western Front. Moreover, every male aged between 14 and 60 was conscripted without exemption. Many of the units were intended as simple cannon fodder, being stuffed into an army greatcoat over their civilian clothes and given 2 days weapons training. So hasty was this process that there were insufficient arms to go round, and there came into being the tactics whereby the leading attack wave would be armed with rifles or machine pistols, while the rear waves left the trenches unarmed, being required to pick up the weapon of a fallen front wave soldier on the traverse towards the German lines. The danger in this proceeding must have been obvious even to the simple-minded, and the Russian Army Command solved it by having NKVD Secret Service troops, the secret police, on hand to forcibly clear the trenches at the word of command. During this attack, I witnessed at first hand how the Russian waverers and doubters were simply shot down from behind while the others headed for the German lines as if confronting nothing more worrisome than a heavy shower of hail. For us, it was a rabbit shoot. The terrain before us a killing field of indescribable size with walls of Russian dead and seriously wounded. The corpses piled up, often towering higher than the height of a man. The rear wave attackers had to climb up the dead, who were incidentally useful as bullet traps since they provided cover and prevented us continuing to fire into the rear ranks. Sometimes the dead were stacked so high that the attack would begin to peter out, and tanks had to be brought up to plow a way through, no consideration being given to the screams of the wounded during this activity. The tracks of the T-34S squashed down the cadavers, cracking bones like dry twigs. It was like watching bulldozers flattening a rubbish tip composed of a humanity, some of which was still living, and screamed and cursed in its death agony. The battle escalated. When some of the attackers finally got through after we ran short of ammunition, they were repulsed with bayonet and sharpened entrenching tool. Our defense was berserk enough to ensure that by evening the Russian attack, lacking numbers, disintegrated.